So
Thank you,
that
Andrew.
brings us on to our last speaker, Victoria. So a quick introduction. Our next speaker is Victoria Jaqua. Is that?
Jaqua.
Jaqua. Apologies for the poor pronunciation there. And Victoria is going to be talking about OSMS, the open source medical supplies. Victoria is a registered radiology technologist specializing in cardiac catheterization procedures. And when she's not working in a clinical job, she's in the medical community lead for the open source medical supplies. So without giving too many more spoilers away, I will hand over to Victoria, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ike, and it's wonderful to connect with the UK community. OSMS began in March of 2020, and some international AM communities we've had a lot of contact with, I'm thinking of per country, and we just didn't have a whole lot of connection with the UK communities. I remember some makers in Wales, some in Cornwall back in those times, but it's wonderful to connect more deeply and to be invited to this meeting. So thank you so much. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. So moving forward with open source design for additive manufacturing for medical humanitarian aid, this is going to be a historical view of the pandemic, what it means for some action items, and a little bit of a pithy presentation that I hope reaches across some presentations that even I didn't get to attend, because I'm seeing some commonalities in everyone's presentation on next steps. So a little bit about me. I am a RRT, and when I'm not working in the hospital, I'm the medical community lead for OSMS. I'm a board member at Public Convention, the founder of which, Robert Reed, is attending. And this year, I have taken on a new position as a growth partner for an open source company in Ontario, Canada, called GLIA. And I've been working with Dr. Pierce's lab, assisting GLIA with their open source tourniquet project development. So OSMS began in March of 2020. We have a Facebook community that at the height of the pandemic was about 75,000 international members. And for the first few months of the pandemic, we did not have a website. We had a website in June of 2020. The entire open source PPE, additive manufacturing, and retooled manufacturing movement on our side of the fence really existed with a set of Google documents and a Facebook group for the first 4 months of the pandemic. And that's when the most major points of production started. As a result, we published a very popular white paper, Design, Make, Protect, that curated data from the Facebook group and our international AM community that documented 48 million PPE units made at a replacement cost of about $271 million. Now, over the past few years, as I've continued to be active in the maker and AM community, I've made a private evaluation that of the data that we curated, it is a very small part of what actually happened. I'm constantly coming across groups that I didn't have connection with then, and discovering that, oh yeah, we made 12,000 face shields. Oh yeah, we made 50,000 masks, and that data was never captured. So I would say of the data that we have, it's between a third or a tenth of probably what actually happened. So a lot of people think about, OSMS started and we, made all of this open source AM manufacturing happen. And it didn't really start out that way. There was a really perfect intersection of maybe never reproducible again events. We had the global pandemic emergency. We had the supply chain gap, especially for N95 masks and PPE. We had domestic lockdowns, which for at least the first 3 to 4 months provided a lot of free time for retold manufacturers and university systems and private makers to suddenly have room to do some work. There was in existence a AM and retold manufacturing network that already existed through maker spaces and university labs and medical systems. And this, of course, varied depending on what country you looked at. There was some initial domestic, state, federal, and local support. This would vary by country. The most powerful intersection, I would say, is probably the internet. For the first time in history, you could rapidly share accurate information and you had good communication platforms. And I would say even more than that, the most critical element of this was for the first time, you had open communication between medical systems that were doing their own testing in-house with their infectious disease department and university labs, and sharing the resulting designs and feedback with the community being makers or manufacturers. So in the first week, when we realized that PPE was going to be needed, the surge was, we need to create open source medical device designs. And you have to remember, there were really no open source designs back then. There weren't open source N95 mask designs. There weren't mask designs in general. The United States wasn't used to wearing a mask. We were dealing with a rolling emergency where you had a pandemic surge, healthcare workers were dying, and there were no designs. So I cannot describe to you the incredible speed and information dump that happened in the Facebook group. And I was the person in that group every day combing through comment threads, harvesting designs, regulatory links, studies, material standards, because we had so many skill sets coming into this group. It wasn't just makers, it was biomedical engineers, retired professors, use case human design experts. So many skill sets just pouring massive amounts of information into this Facebook group. And somebody had to extract that information and move it into documents. And I was part of the team that did that. So for the first 2 months of the pandemic, we saw designs publicly being shared by university and medical systems that were then shared within our group, and then we moved into our curation program. The AM networks, and I say that encompassing anyone from a small makerspace or a single 3D printer at home or a seamster making masks to a retooled manufacturer. There's a wide spectrum of the type of maker that responded to the pandemic. The maker came second. The thing that spurred this movement, this surge, was, oh my gosh, we have some sort of design to start with. And the hospital likes it and they're already using it. And this would just explode into iterations. And, I'm going to make this for this hospital. This is their feedback, and I'm going to share it back to the community. So if we didn't have that initial sharing of testing, fast, and they probably would not have been as confident in what they were making. So OSMS did not create designs. We existed to track, support, and curate the medical designs and documentation, both from and to the additive manufacturer pandemic response. Within the first 2 weeks, we have created the medical supply guide, which was a description of what COVID-19 was. At the time, there wasn't a really good source of truth for what COVID was. And we put as much open source information about that as we could in our supply guide, which also included design files. This led to our public health guide ecosystem And within our medical supply guide, we curated as many resources as we could regarding material standards, regulatory guidance, university research. And this focus on documentation also pulled in really amazing partners that created their own platforms. One of highlights is Maker Mask, which is run by a biomedical professor, Dr. Songer, and she provided really wonderful analog testing protocols for protective fabrics, which was really important for makers working on masks and protective gowns. So if OSMS and our partner data throughout 2020, it is very probable that these designs and the Maker AM movement would be completely forgotten. Makers were named the 2020 Forbes Most Disruptive Innovator, but that doesn't mean that the information and the networks that existed were preserved. You know, the making community is much bigger than a blurb in Forbes. So we're very fortunate we got to document and elevate the amazing amount of work this community did. So in the white paper, we have a large policy section at the end where we identify some challenges and recommendations for overcoming them. There was a really large restricted access to testing centers. Cost was prohibitive, as well as testing centers being overwhelmed with imported product, where people were trying to identify what is good PPE and what's not. Enormous lack of publicly available testing protocols for additive manufacturing, whether this be testing materials, what materials are accessible, protective impact testing, aerosol testing, very difficult to find standards. No really standards in place for face shields. However, there were some public available standards for N95s. What constitutes an N95? What is the filtering standard? And people would reverse engineer from that. Lots, like I said, manufacturing material standards for PPE were not available. After the first surge and imports began to come back, there was kind of a lack of interest to revisit designs and try to improve them, create more robust designs, or, let's, discover the material standard for this design and, what's acceptable. An overwhelming dependence on imported PPE really hurt local markets that wanted to retool. And this was a multi-tiered problem, because LMICs in Central America were getting poor quality PPE imported that Western countries were rejecting because it was so bad, but they were dumping it in Central America. And healthcare workers were dying because there were no testing protocols available to test this commercially created PPE. And a similar problem happened in the UK. A lot of your imported PPE at the time came from Turkey. And there was a lot of pushback from the NHS privately from the healthcare workers saying, this is poor quality stuff, and being told, no, this comes from a vetted facility and it's good, but the gown would tear. Lack of market and regulatory support for domestic manufacturers. And at the end of the day, even though some medical systems publicly acknowledged the PPE, overall there was little public acknowledgement or financial compensation. I would say almost all of the PPE that was tracked in our report was donated. So obviously additive manufacturing is out of the box, and we've made huge leaps from doing a fun 3D printed project in our garage to having the ability to be a legitimate crisis response and a really strong medical manufacturing innovation So how do we build on these successes and overcome the challenges? And here's where I'm going to step way back, you know, thinking really big picture, because a lot of the success of OSMS came because we rode this wave of energy. We saw the trend of what the people needed, and what we were being told from regulatory agencies, you know, the White House, the CDC at the time, was completely different than what was happening on the ground. And we were responding to what was on the ground and seeing the surge of information coming out of the hospitals and what the people on the ground really needed. And that's a really important energy and information flow to be aware of, because when you want to respond crisis and humanitarian aid, knowing where the true flow of information is and how you can help is really important. So a lot of missteps from trusted authorities are continuing to cause unease in public health leadership. First, denying that COVID is airborne, claiming that there was enough PPE in 2020 when healthcare workers clearly demonstrated the opposite. We have reduced access to testing supplies and public health data. Only 3 out of 50 states are currently reporting COVID hospitalizations. There is a reduction of isolation protocols. We are down to a 5-day isolation period instead of a 10 to 14-day isolation when the highest level of transmission for the Omicron variant is 10 to 14 days. So people are returning to work while they're still infectious. And there's been a one and done pinning all hopes on vaccination rather than a multi-approach protection. So as a result of this multi-tier public health failure, grassroots networks that are vetted medical experts, engineers, air science experts are using their own messaging, their own networks to spread public health information rather than waiting on top-down authorities to care or to change their own messaging. This is a very, very important trend to follow and know how you fit into it as someone focusing on humanitarian aid or crisis response. So in March, we lead and curate the open source PP production. In August of 2020, the Corsi Rosenthal box debuts, which is a very easy DIY build for less than $100, increases your indoor ACH and your viral aerosol exposure. This one design has led to a robust community of Corsi box makers and users and peer-reviewed publication. It is a citizen accessible build and very effective for preventing viral spread. In April of 2020, Makers Asylum designed the M1902, which used many previously documented open source oxygen concentrator designs, including the RepRap, which is one of the very first OC designs out there. They combined all of OC specifically for tropical. So August of this year, I saw some really important open source messaging come across. I've been following Aaron Collins, who's a leader in public mask education. He has announced Open Arrows, which is a new open source ecosystem for creating air quality and mask standards available to the public. The Ontario Science Table has been a critical public health viral alert system that is now being disbanded. And grassroots medical experts are now wanting to create a new independent open source group that will share this data publicly. And the White House OSTP recently required all federally funded research to be publicly available. Now, all of these are very unique examples, but at the end of the day, each one of these movements or organizations are doing something that is, at the end of the day, open source, publicly available information. And when you have publicly available information, it eventually leads to guidance, and you can educate the public. I think we've thought of open source as solely a software or hardware platform. Or maybe in the broadest sense, an ecosystem where, as Adrian Bauer said, machine A makes machine B and machine B makes parts for machine A. I want us to think even further than this. I think the success of open source needs to be presented as a critical element of public infrastructure, where medical, scientific, manufacturing, regulatory, government, and charitable partners can intersect very effectively for the public good. And we have crisis, especially in Western countries, where your insufficient investment in public infrastructure, especially public health, is leading us into a lot of domestic crises. The NHS in the UK and the Canadian healthcare system are held up as these bastions of, public health accessibility. And every year, that system is threatened with erosion into privatization. And I think open source as a value system, as a concept, as a culture, has a foundational value that can help influence the creation of true public infrastructure. So the responsibility of AM that I think we're dealing with right now is similar to the AM manufacturers in March 2020. They didn't want to make something that didn't work. They didn't want to bring something to the hospital that wasn't safe. And they didn't want to make 500 of something if nobody wanted it. So there was already a foundation of ethics, I feel, in the AM community, at least that I was involved in. And we need to develop this into a project, into a culture for the entire open source community. And I think open know-how that Andrew Lamb talked about is a great part of that. However, for decentralized manufacturing and AM communities, there's very little or no regulatory pathways unless you're making certain devices and you're going to privatize, you're just going to sell a design. I feel that we must create a QA/QC process for ourselves. So we're going to get to action items here. Documentation and collaboration is really, really essential. I think of the glory days of 2020, from especially March to June, the amount of documentation, collaboration, and desire to not over-replicate work was absolutely astounding. And I was constantly putting teams together across countries, across time zones, because they were all at a similar point in their project, or they were working on a similar design. And I put them together so that they wouldn't be siloed. And this just moved projects forward so quickly. So I think it's important, even if you're a fab lab or a single maker, that you really add to your community and you share your information, your best practices, your research, publications, and you try to keep track of who in your community is doing what. Because more likely than not, someone somewhere is reinventing the wheel. And you can save someone somewhere a lot of time if you can give them a resource, if you can show a failure that you overcame, and also not just how to make a thing, but the system, the best practice of the system that produced the thing. And this is something that I'm kind of passionate about recently, is we need not to just open source product and how to make a product, but open source an effective system. If a team in Malawi is creating mobile response biomedical teams that are going and fixing oxygen concentrators in rural Malawi, we can teach people how to replicate that system. How do you build a biomedical team? How many clinics do you need to see? How do you collect your data? How do you make this team so that other countries that have the same problems can also replicate what's effective? We need to create an open source testing library. This would eventually become an open source medical regulatory agency, and I'm going to share this slide set so everyone can look at the links in here. A testing library would allow a decentralized manufacturer in the AM network to identify a test on their device, how to do the test. It would curate open source designs for testing and education hardware. This harkens back to the design for the 3D printed vaginal anatomical model that Samantha spoke about. This testing library could be a home for a design like that and create an ecosystem of guidance and education just from that one design. From this testing library, you can create a testing data collection, interpretation, and obviously public reports on the data and innovation progress. This would eventually become an open source medical regulatory agency. If open source medical can show that it's self-governing and it really cares about the standards and quality of the product they would like decentralized manufacturing to make, it's very probable that more collaboration and recognition can happen from established regulatory agencies. What I'm seeing now is, even though established agencies recognize the power of open source, it's two different streams. There's only certain pathways for open source into the current regulatory system. And essentially, we need to create our own system of QA and QC, and this will help elevate our community and be more recognizable. And we need to communicate the culture of open source because we're actively challenging the culture of privatization. We have to constantly communicate the open source values and the impact they have on public good, which is usually very pivotal response times because why? We have access to open source data, open source designs. We're not reinventing the wheel all the time. Strong efforts for decolonization and supporting local markets, accessible information, and obviously endless innovations are possible from this. As top-down systems continue to fail, if we create strong open source platforms and systems, we have the opportunity to elevate these into influencing better public systems that will step in to replace the failed ones. So I believe open source is the wave of the future. It's going to exhibit itself in very surprising ways. 2020 was the soil, open source is the seed. And we have opportunities to create really effective public response networks, which have almost endless applications. As long as we support the current open source networks and we continue to understand, especially from the medical side, how we can organize and produce sustainable but also quality, safe product. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Victoria, for a really enlightening talk. It's always difficult being the last speaker in the presentation, but you did a good job there of keeping the energy up and the interest in the audience. So fortunately, time is starting to escape us, but if there was any burning questions, we could maybe have one quick one.
I'll take it. Can you talk a little bit more about how we make an open source regulatory agency? And do you imagine that being global or still at the national levels?
Just as a caveat before we start, just because some of us have to soon run off on the school run, if we could keep it as a short response. I am sorry to have to do that, but just in the interest of time.
So I think that if we think about it as, oh my God, we need to create a regulatory agency, it's very intimidating. And we need to talk to governments and the FDA and ISO and all that. We actually don't need to start there. We need to start by creating an open source unit testing device for a tourniquet and documenting how to make that testing device, how to do the test, how to collect data from the test, and how to communicate that data into a clinical parameter, and how then to communicate that clinical parameter to a medical practitioner and somebody in the field who's never used a tourniquet before. This is the type of ecosystem I'm talking about. So imagine that all of that information was public, and it wasn't just in a peer-reviewed publication, say the paper is a start, but then you extract from that paper how to do X, Y, and Z. So someone who is not an academic, who is not an engineer, who is in the field, who has never made a tourniquet before, feels successful in making this design. And imagine you did that same thing for 5 or 6 other devices, and you posted, here's how to do analog testing, XYZ. This is where you build a library. And then I think the first step is to build the library. And Rob is a leader of this. I'm kind of the other half of his brain. We don't need to start up here. We start here on the ground floor. And as we build something effective and show that, hey, we really care that you do this tourniquet thing right, that you make it right and you test it right and you have the information in the field when you need it, just showing the effort on that level, I think, and doing that, compounded and compounded and compounded, will automatically lead to the creation of a regulatory agency of some kind.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you for that response. And I do apologize again that we're just running out of time for further questions. I know my questions alone would probably keep you occupied for several hours, a bit like the last time we spoke together. So yes, but thank you so much for joining us and imparting all of that useful wisdom onto us. And there's plenty to think about for the future there.